Raise your hand if you can hear me in the back. Excellent. Today, and for as long as I've been at the bank, and even before that, we have this battle raging across our networks and our endpoints. It's actually been going on since before the beginning. Maybe not everybody remembers it, but the World Wide Web didn't go online until 1989. The Morris Internet worm emerged in November of 1988. So we have had attacks in the internet since before there was a web. And of course, we've had attacks on enterprise systems since before that. I agree with my friend Mark Gazit that the good guys win in the end. But in order for Mark to know what to build, and in order for me to know what to invest in from Citi Ventures and what to buy from the global information security side of Citi, we need to understand the nature of the conflict that we're in, and we have to understand how it's going to end. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. But I'm going to start by talking about a little bit of history from a totally different set and type of conflicts. So this is roughly, in my own handwriting, a map of the Eastern Front in World War II. And the red dot on the center right is Stalingrad, which was the biggest battle of the Eastern Front in World War II. And if you think about it for a little while, it's kind of confusing why there would be a huge battle at Stalingrad. Stalingrad isn't the capital of Russia. It hasn't ever been. The capital at the time was Moscow, which is the yellow dot up and to the right. There were no particularly significant military installations in Stalingrad. So it's hard to tell, why here. So the red line is the Eastern Front in World War II. And the answer to why here is because of the two blue dots. So down at Ploesti in Romania is where the German army got its oil from to run its tanks. And down at Baku in Azerbaijan is where the Russians got their oil. And the German army didn't have enough oil to compete on both fronts simultaneously, and so it wanted more, and of course the Russian army wanted to be able to continue to supply itself. So the Germans eventually drove to the purple dot there at the top of the Black Sea. That's a place called Rostov. And we're going to try to drive on to Baku and take over the oil fields. And they needed to make sure that there wasn't going to be a huge Russian army coming in behind them and cutting off their food supplies and the roads that they would use to get the oil back to Germany. And so, of course, there was a huge battle at Stalingrad, which is where sort of all the roads intersect and where the Russian army was going to come from if it went to Rostov. So the whole concept of World War II on the Eastern Front was who could preserve access to enough oil to put into the tanks to win the battles. And this is not, it was not a new concept, of course, at the time of the Second World War. The same idea drove the United States Civil War. This is Winfield Scott, who is still the longest serving general officer in the United States Army, and he designed the strategy for the Union Army in the Civil War. And the strategy was illustrated by this famous poster. And the idea was really simple. The North was an industrial region, and the South was an agricultural region. And in order to fight a war, the South was going to need access to iron and to lead and to coal to run trains and things like that. And Scott decided that the way to defeat the Southern state, not just the Southern Army, was to create a naval blockade around the coast so that supplies couldn't come in from overseas, and then to cut the South in half along the Mississippi, which was the major transport route for a big part of the South, and then finally run General Sherman through Georgia to Atlanta, which was the major rail hub. So it's not an accident that the two big intentional battles of the Civil War, not accidental battles like Gettysburg, but intentional battles that were the objectives of campaigns, were at Vicksburg on the Mississippi and Atlanta in the railhead. And again, here the idea was that the Union command staff wanted to deny the southern nation access to the resources it needed to have to continue the fight. That was an old idea even at that time. Kutuzov, another Russian general, used this idea to defeat Napoleon when he invaded Russia. And this is the very famous graph of the size of Napoleon's army on the way to Moscow and on the way back. 400,000 members of the French army crossed the river in Poland to go on the Russian campaign. 10,000 came back. And it wasn't because they had a lot of pitched battles. It was because Kutuzov continually retreated in front of the French army, burned the crops in the field, and denied the French army access to the resources it needed to have to sustain itself. The French army arrived in Moscow, which Kutuzov burned before he evacuated it, in late September, and then winter came, and cold and typhus decimated the French army. And again, the main problem that Napoleon had was that he didn't have access to food, he didn't have access to feed for his horses and other supplies. So this is a lesson that we haven't taken very much in the information security community. We have been fighting mostly to stop the attacks and the attack tools as they hit our perimeter or as they hit our endpoints. And that will hold off the worst of the damage for a while, but it won't win the battle. And so what I think will win the battle is an approach which deliberately tries to deny resources to our attackers so that they eventually can't sustain the expense required to continue the attack. And this isn't entirely a hypothetical. So at Citi Ventures, we have a portfolio company. It's called Pindrop Security. The product is designed to defeat phone fraud. And the core observation that the guys at Pindrop made was that somebody who wants to use a telephone call to a call center at a bank to steal money has a bunch of free resources at his disposal. He can get as many email addresses as he wants. He can get as many phone numbers as he wants. He can get as many virtual desktop or mobile phone operating system images as he wants so that his system doesn't have to look the same to my defenses every time he comes in. He also, though, has to have a critical piece of equipment to execute the attack, and that is a telephone. If you're going to call a call center, you've got to use a telephone to call the call center. So all of these other things are easily replicable. The telephone isn't easily replicable. The cheapest telephone you can get is, I don't know, probably 20 or 25 bucks for, a used Android or feature phone or something like that. And 20 or 25 bucks doesn't sound like a lot, but if you are running a boiler room telephone fraud operation, you're making thousands of calls a day to various different banking systems. And if every time you make a call, the system is able to fingerprint your telephone and put it on a list of telephones that have been used for fraud, and that list isn't just stored at one institution, it's shared across all the institutions that might be the victims of fraud, then what that essentially means is that your telephone is a one-time fraud device. And it's a one-time $25 fraud device. So your success rate for fraud, which isn't very high, right? It's in the single-digit percents or lower, and your payoff amount has to be high enough to sustain an ongoing cost of $25 per call in order to make fraud a sustainable business. Our guess is that telephone fraud is going to be essentially taken off the table by innovations like this, because the cost of executing the attack will become too great. So I think the challenge of the next couple of years in the security community is going to be to focus a lot more not on our resources and not on our technical defenses, but on the adversary's resources and on ways that we can make the adversary consume those resources so that the business case for theft and fraud and various other forms of cyber mischief just becomes negative, and the bad guys essentially have to declare bankruptcy and move on to something else. There is a probably fictitious ancient Chinese character who had a book attributed to him called The 36 Stratagems of Lord Tan Daoji, and one of the stratagems he recommends is to steal the firewood from under the pot of the enemy. And what he means there is look at where your adversary is harvesting resources, look at the nature of those resources, and take them away, and the threat will dissipate on its own. So that's my task for the future of the next couple of years of the cybersecurity industry, is to steal the firewood from under the pot of the adversaries. Thanks very much.